everybody for joining us this evening. Now, the topic of the oration tonight, which is leadership in science, how it impacts jobs of the future, innovation and energy security in Australia, is something I have great personal interest in as an engineer and passionate innovation leader at CBA. Our world is changing very fast, and one industry that's undergoing tremendous change is the energy markets. This need for leadership, vision and a long-term plan that led the government to commission Dr. Alan Finkel and his team to perform an independent review into the future security of the national electricity market, the final report of which was released in June. And so it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Finkel, who is our keynote speaker tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Finkel to address us.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Gillian, for your introductory words. I've got to say it's humbling and uplifting when you get the chance to meet some of the John Monash scholars that you were talking about, Gillian. And I had the opportunity just mingling in the foyer to meet a few. One who's passionate about and has been doing a lot of work in renewable energy, one scholar who's a world expert in period music for Shakespearean plays, so you get a bit of variety, and another scholar who's in human rights and has had the privilege and was very effective in helping defend the Australian government's plain packaging cigarette laws in the International Court. It's just amazing to see young people who have achieved so much. Now, Kelly, I'm going to cheat a little and not speak specifically about the electricity network because I've been speaking about that so much. I needed some change. So I will bring it in, but it won't be the main theme. Instead, I'm going to talk a little bit about the intersection of my life with General Sir John Monash, and I'm not pretending that I'm up there at that level, but there have been some things that make me feel a little connected to him, and these are aspects of leadership and planning. So General Sir John Monash, he was really one of those remarkable people who blaze through life collecting careers. By my count, he had at least 24 careers. It's not bad. You actually hear about young people today facing a life of 20 to 25 job changes, but John Monash has really shown them how to do it. He thrived in peace and war, in business and government, through the Depression and in times of prosperity, in public and in private life. And we honour Sir John Monash to this day on the $100 note. And if you added up all the $100 notes in circulation, you would put Sir John Monash's value at approximately $30 billion, which is about the same as the Harry Potter brand. But of course, Sir John Monash is much bigger than Potter. Sir John Monash is priceless. Now, without doubt, anybody would be flattered for the opportunity to deliver, as I am, the John Monash Foundation Oration. But for me, it is a little personal. It's the 8 years that I served as Chancellor of Monash University and the 52,512 new graduate hands that I shook during that time. It's the hours of my life that I spent on the daily drive to and from the university, driving on the Monash Freeway. It's the John Monash scholars I've come to know, some of them who I just mentioned, and all of them are incredible people. And most of all, it's a night that's seared in my brain that could almost convince me to believe in fate. Almost. Thursday, October the 6th of 2016. There I am, I'm driving home from speaking at a launch of a new science centre at Scotch College in Melbourne, in the electorate of Kooyong. Scotch College, which was John Monash's beloved school. It's approaching 11 p.m. and I take a call from the Federal Minister for Energy. Alan, he said, would you accept a commission to rescue electricity in Australia? Electricity, which was the last great commission in Sir John Monash's life. As the inaugural chair of the Victorian State Electricity Commission from 1920 until his death in 1931, General Monash was truly a father of the electricity grid. You could think of him as our very own General Electric, as well as my personal hero. I clocked in my first full day of work on our National Electricity Market Review on October the 8th, the very day we marked the 85th anniversary of General Sir John Monash's death. And ringing in my ears to this day are the words that he delivered in a speech from 1924, which was one of the many salvos that he would fire in this last great phase of his life. So let me read 3 sentences to you. Electric energy has become the servitor of humanity. Its utility is destined to expand until it dominates future civilization. Even our homes have been invaded, and the conditions of domestic life have been wholly transformed. The world is becoming, by a process of peaceful penetration, steadily but nonetheless surely electrified. The title of that speech was Power and Progress, the Era of Electricity. We could have borrowed it verbatim for the review of the national electricity market, which is more commonly known as the Finkel Review, that we published in June of this year. No, I actually don't believe that even the great General Sir John Monash could have orchestrated the events to create the perfect lead-in for my speech tonight, but the mind does wonder. And I do know what it's like to be haunted by the very thought of his disapproval. He just had that effect on people. Well into the 1960s, Prime Minister Robert Menzies would tell the story of a long, distant day in the midst of the Great Depression when the Victorian government dared to refuse Sir John Monash a request for £1 million, which would be about $75 million in today's currency. Menzies was a junior minister in Victoria at the time. Now, when Monash heard the news, he invited himself to a meeting with the Premier and the Cabinet, which the Premier found he could not refuse. As Monash entered the room, all present rose to their feet. "Mr. Premier," he said, "I gather that the Cabinet has rejected my proposal." The Cabinet collectively shuffled its feet. "Well," he continued, "that can only be because they have utterly failed to understand it. I will now explain." And half an hour later, with the Cabinet reduced to a withering heap of abject misery and desperate repentance, Monash produced the necessary legal contract. And it was signed, and Monash departed with his £1 million. More than 3 decades on, Sir Robert Menzies lived with the trauma of that occasion. I think he saw it as character building. And sometimes I think to myself that it wouldn't be such a bad thing if we all lived with that image of Sir John Monash, waiting just outside the door, ready to walk in and bludgeon us into submission by his brilliance. So how would we tackle the great challenges of our time if we could live up to the Monash expectation? In particular, how would we tackle the challenge that I was gifted on the night of October the 6th, the challenge that Sir John Monash called power and progress, and that we have inherited as the great electricity trilemma. Electricity, make it cleaner, make it cheaper, make it constant. And in the spirit of Monash, make it happen. I'm convinced that we can, and if the recommendations of our review are adopted, we will. But let me step back from the electricity review just for a moment to give you a sense of our place in history. In 1924, Monash drew a line in time, and he called everything to the right of that line in time the electric age. In hindsight, we might have described it as Electric Age 1.0. It was built on the assumption that there would be one statewide grid and one government-owned operator. The electrons would come from just a small number of big generators, and those generators would burn Victorian coal. The electricity would then be used for lighting, for cooking, industrial processes like smelting, and to power the motors of our factories and public transport. Centralised, controlled, predictable electricity 1.0. The next age began with computers. Why? Because computers completely overturned expectations. Before computers, a blackout that lasted a day, it would be inconvenient. After computers, a blackout that lasted a millisecond could be catastrophic. And computers, they did something else as well. They souped up science, technology, and innovation to a frantic pace. With the aid of our thinking machines, we began to envisage a world where electrons could come from a solar panel on your roof, where 2 million solar panels on rooftops all across Australia could feed into the grid, along with wind farms and solar farms and gas-fired generators and batteries, where the one grid could be broken up into microgrids, allowing households to trade their electrons peer-to-peer, where you could manage all these things from the opposite side of the world via an app on your telephone, where everyone on the planet, all 7.5 billion of us, would demand the incredible electric life that we take for granted, where cyber criminals and solar storms and a speck of dust colliding with the satellite in space could turn our orderly existence on its head. Throw climate change into the equation and you have disruption, rampant disruption, electricity 2.0. And so now we come to our place in the story, another bright line in time, and we cast our minds forward to what might come. In the past, in speeches, I've called this future the electric planet, but we could think of it today as electricity 3.0. And it falls into some of the discussion that we had in a chapter of the Finkel Review, which we called Beyond the Blueprint. And it takes us several decades into the future. Electricity 3.0 looks like this. We start by converting all electricity generation to zero emission sources, all of it. We back up those sources with storage technologies that we've barely begun to imagine. But it's not enough. We now need to double or even triple that electricity supply, that clean, zero-emission electricity supply. We ramp up that reliable, clean electricity production, and then we can run the world electric. Electricity instead of petrol in cars. Electricity instead of gas heating in homes. And I repeat, it was beyond the blueprint, but it's well worth keeping in mind. So here we are at our particular point in time. From the past, we have the brilliant legacy of Sir John Monash. Going into the future, the electric planet, electricity 3.0. Right here, right now, the great challenge of our time. How would I urge you, the present and future leaders of our society, to proceed? Let me boil my answer down into 3 words: aspiration, encouragement, and education. Aspiration, encouragement, education. We need all of them to get things done. Number 1, aspiration. Aspiration, it's not simply imagination. It's imagination plus action. It is striving for the dreams in your mind, in the rock-solid belief that there is always a better way. And if you want it, you can claim it. That ethos is the essence of good engineering. John Monash expressed it as the difference between executing an instruction and reframing the expectation. He thought that the country back then was bogged down, lacking in vision, and incapable of imagining anything better than just doing more of the same. And he said so all of the time. And he treated the country's engineers as the equivalent of the jump leads on the nation's soul, connected to the battery of his brain, his way of firing up the impulse for change. Evolve the vision, mature it, and share it. He said that to his fellow engineers. Help people to work together for a future that they might actually want. Not just different, a better future. And I have now spent the last 10 months of my life travelling the country, listening to businesses and communities, and talking to public servants and politicians. And my colleagues and I had one goal in mind: to frame the way forward for Electricity 2.0. And it was clear to us that across the nation there is a passionate desire for change. And that those who are most passionate, those who seek out the evidence, reach for solutions, and put skin in the game, are those who are driven by the vision of a better future. It's not those who are living in the mirage of a golden past, not those warning of a global apocalypse. It's those who have aspiration, those who say that our electric future can be great, should be great, and will be great. Number 2, encouragement. The next time you're cruising down a highway in California or zipping in your rental car around Norway, you'll see something new and striking on the side of the road. You'll see stations where you can charge an electric car. And the charging units at those stations, they're beautiful. They're works of art. Streamlined, elegant and gleaming. And when you plug in, you feel a surge of the future. Where did those elegant charging stations come from? Would you believe me if I told you they came from Queensland? That the very first time I saw this charger, it was just an ugly sheet metal box with protruding wires, a bit like a partly disassembled Dalek from the props department of Doctor Who. That the proud owners and builders were 3 young men who initially set out to develop an electric vehicle motor controller, with no idea then that they would one day be building electric highways all over the world. It's true, and it's a reminder that dreams do scale, with encouragement. Back then, I was involved in an electric car charging company called Better Place, or Better Place Australia. And I had the privilege of leading our company in a project to support these 3 young men and their company called Tritium to develop their prototype fast charger. We paid for it. Through our own vision of a transformational new market, we encouraged the engineers at Tritium to pursue a novel opportunity. They also received encouragement from the University of Queensland, where the founders met as students in the university's solar car racing team. Subsequently, they were backed by public investment, and just as important, they were encouraged to demonstrate their technology in pilot projects here in Australia. A fortnight ago, I picked up a copy of The Economist magazine. And on the front cover, beautifully illustrated, was a picture of a clapped-out petrol engine, oozing oil and covered in rust. And above it, in giant letters, was the words, roadkill. And on the inside, the lead article with the title, The Death of the Internal Combustion Engine. Incredible to read this in The Economist. The Economist is one of the most significant journals of our time. It's incredible to even think about this possibility. But that kind of great change is simply the sum total of many courageous decisions, not just by students and inventors, but by investors and governments and consumers and regulators. Courage. General Sir John Monash knew a great deal about the art of encouragement. He inspired men in battle, just like he persuaded governments to give him £1 million at home. Relentless preparation, mastery of the detail, and willingness to take absolute responsibility for the outcome. And that is how he encouraged others to take not a leap in faith, but instead to take a calculated risk. Venture capital, that's important, but courage capital, well invested, is gold. And finally, to number 3, education. Part of the Monash legend is the story of the day in 1930 when he was invited by some disgruntled compatriots to lead a military coup. I kid you not, Australia, 1930, he was invited to lead a military coup. And General Sir John Monash replied by letter, "Depend on it, the only hope for Australia is the ballot box and an educated electorate." And he was right. But education is not merely the prerequisite for a measured, respectful, intelligent public debate, and I do believe that such a debate is possible. Education is the way we arm ourselves for life. And Monash, who sat for 94 examinations in 17 years of tertiary education, knew the power of education far more than most. Now, one of my duties as Chancellor of Monash University was to do the honours of graduations and listen attentively to the Vice-Chancellor's speech. And I did that at least 20 times a year. And the same John Monash quote would appear every time. And in fairness to the Vice-Chancellor, it's worth repeating. Adopt as your fundamental creed that you will equip yourself for life, not only for your own benefit, but for the benefit of the whole community. In this quote, General Sir John Monash goes beyond today's mantra on what's wrong with education in Australia. The critics today, they chant that we must train our students for the modern world, equip them with 21st century skills, and of course we must. Sir John Monash knew that. And at the dawn of the 21st century, he spoke to that, because that's what he meant when he talked about students equipping themselves for the benefit of the whole community. But his starting premise was that the students had to equip themselves for their lifelong careers with foundational skills and knowledge. And for them to do so, the educators have to set the bar of aspiration high. They should raise the bar high for every student in English, in science, and in mathematics. But that itself is not enough. Our education system is then obliged, as its most important priority, to do its utmost to help our students to clear the high bar. It's a good model. Let's call it the high bar and coach model, the high bar and coach model of education. And for proof, you only have to look at the John Monash Scholars here tonight. Every single John Monash Scholar is a product of high aspirations and great coaching. So let me leave you tonight with that final image. General Sir John Monash at the door, your door. General Sir John Monash, who insists it can be done. And General Sir John Monash, who says that you're the person to do it. Let's live up to his expectations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Finkel, for sharing those remarks with us. And who could disagree with aspiration, encouragement, and education? Definitely all needed. And thank you not only for your remarks, but also for the significant contribution you're making to position Australia for a much better energy future. So thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce one of the John Monash Scholars to address us this evening, and that is Lara Olsen. And Lara is the Regional Manager of Business Development for Tesla Energy in Asia Pacific. So please join me in welcoming Lara.
Thanks, Kelly, and to everyone here tonight. And thank you, Alan, for both your review of the electricity system, which is desperately needed, and also your speech. In response to Alan's speech, I also want to focus on John Monash and the values that we could take from him and in particular how they could be applied to the electricity system, and also how I see them applied to the foundation. When I first read about John Monash, I was quite excited about the similarities. John Monash was born on the 27th of June. I was born on the 26th of June, but quite late at night, so I figured that it nearly counted. John Monash studied engineering and arts and law at Melbourne University. I studied engineering and arts at Melbourne University, so nearly. And then in high school, John Monash was encouraged by his teachers to also consider a career in the dramatic arts. In high school, I received strong feedback that was reiterated at parent-teacher interviews not to pursue a career in the arts, and that enthusiasm does not always convert to talent, and I should focus on mathematics. And I think all this to say that whilst we can look up to John Monash and we can try and emulate many of his achievements, we won't all be able to follow his path, but I think we can follow many of his values. And in particular for me, there's two values that really stand out. Firstly, the value that he placed on difference and diversity and understanding different fields and using that knowledge to bring it from either other fields of disciplines or overseas back to Australia. We see that in the fact that he did study, and I think Alan mentioned 94 exams across different fields. We also see it in what he applied to the military. And there's a famous lecture that some people might know about in 1894 when Monash talked about the fact that fine horsemanship would not be what would win the war in the future. And instead, he started to apply his engineering thoughts around planning and progress and military science. For some people at the time, that seemed quite controversial, but Monash, to Alan's point, believed and did his research and then applied it. And as many of you would know, Monash was one of our greatest, not only Australia, but more worldwide in terms of our military leaders. He also did this in his engineering firm. So Monash read widely in terms of both French and German building procedures. And actually, he found a Monnier method that was actually named after a Frenchman who was finding that his plant pots were breaking and came up with a method of using iron frames and mortar to increase the strength. He then turned that into a bridge building, which Monash took a number of our bridges, particularly in Victoria, and Monash's business at the time were all the more stronger for it. I think this is a great demonstration of how Monash continued to search for knowledge and was able to bring that back across different fields and in different countries to Australia and then apply it. In his obituary, many people talked about the fact that Monash was always a student. And I think as leaders and as followers, it's something that's important to remember. That said, he wasn't infallible. So Monash, and I find this reassuring, got third-class honours in his engineering degree, partly because he was doing so many other things. And he also, his business was not always a success. It was tough times as well, but Monash pushed through that and had that self-belief. And I think it's important also to remember that brilliance does not always mean succeeding. In fact, it often means trying things that may not work initially, but believing that there is a better future out there. Finally, the second value that I always strive to achieve and really appreciate is Monash's servant leadership. I think he displays this markedly across his career. And depending on your perspective, servant leadership is either an ancient philosophy that started in China in 49 BC, or what is given to us by many of our great religions, or for the management consultants in the room, it's the 1970 Greenleaf essay that he published in one of the management consulting books. I think, though, what it does show us, wherever you believe it came from, was that Monash always knew what it meant to be a leader. That leadership was not there to further himself, but it was there to further others. And again, you see this across the different aspects of his career. When they talk about how Monash led his troops, one of the great quotes that I like was, he was a firm believer in the education of his troops to help them understand their tasks wherever possible. It was his policy to explain what his intentions were before the engagement to help them succeed. And again, on his death, he was admired by all diggers because he held their interest in their heart. And then finally, the quote that Alan mentioned about the fact that you shouldn't equip yourself only for yourself, but for the benefit of the community. I think that the values that Monash displayed, particularly this value of servant leadership, is something that we could apply to many of the challenges that we face. If I look at the energy trilemma that Alan outlined today. To solve this problem of trying to make it cheap and clean and always reliable, and do that in a system that's constantly evolving, we need to start looking at this. We need to appreciate that the answer might come from different disciplines, that it can be both here in Australia and overseas, and that we can apply the best of that to Australia. We also need to remember what we're ultimately doing this for, and that's to serve the people and businesses of Australia now and in the future, so that they are able to turn on the lights, they're able to run their businesses, but they can also do that in a way that protects our environment and our future society. And in the same way, I think that the Monash Foundation lives these values. As Gillian mentioned, Mark Dawson, one of the leading cancer scholars, is one of our scholars. Another scholar that I know well is Danielle Malik. She used international law and finance and currently works at the World Bank. And she has been particularly critical in a lot of the Arab Spring in helping those countries stand up and working with ministries of finance to achieve that, and also working on constitution and finance systems. And Fernando Campo, who's here today. Where's Fernando? Who Gillian also mentioned. I find extremely inspiring in terms of his work, not only representing and being the team leader at the Venice Biennale, but also the exhibition that he's now holding. Clearly, Fernando, you got different advice from me in high school, but it's proven well for you. I think there's, as Gillian mentioned, there's 147 scholars in total, and who's to say which of those scholars will contribute most? Perhaps it actually doesn't matter. We just know that we're a richer country for what those scholars can contribute, that they can go and test themselves against the best in the world, that they can bring that back to Australia and they can contribute to society. I'm grateful that the Monash Foundation took a bet on me 13 years ago and decided that an engineer who had pursued business but believed that she could try and apply that for environmental or social outcomes was worth funding a scholarship for. I now feel like I'm at one of those companies that uses engineering and business to try and achieve environmental outcomes. And some of those outcomes, for us at least, are the largest in the world. And Australia is starting to lead the face, certainly, of utility scale storage. I'm also grateful for all of those that are here that support the foundation. It's you that make these things happen. You might not get to see all of those 147 scholars and what they're achieving, but we're certainly grateful that you've helped us to make it happen. So thank you. So my role currently is to lead our energy storage business, so not the car side, the commercial and grid scale business across Asia Pacific. In terms of what we're hoping to achieve, the whole mission of our company is focused on how we can accelerate that transition to sustainable energy. And we believe that pairing storage with renewables provides dispatchable renewable energy, which is what everyone always talks about, the reason we can't go to higher penetrations of renewable energy. We feel like that storage is the missing piece that allows that to happen. So perhaps not surprisingly, I've been spending a lot of my recent time in South Australia, which I'm excited to say, will be the world's largest utility scale storage. And perhaps more broadly than that, we really do see, Tesla and myself individually, that Australia will be one of the key, founding grounds for different models of how storage will be applied. That's both true at that large scale utility scale storage, which can help secure our grid and provide a level of stability. But it's also true in some of our more remote and regional areas. We see at the moment a number of the other countries that I'm involved in. Philippines has got electricity growing at 12% and still 25 million people without electricity are starting now to move away from looking at diesel and moving towards microgrids, as Alan mentioned. And a lot of that technology can actually be developed, the control systems, etc., in Australia, in our regional and remote areas. 6% of Australia's electricity is off-grid, and that's a great founding ground for then what could get used in Asia Pacific. So at the moment I spend a lot of my time working on those large-scale grid applications that we believe that Australia will be a proving ground for, and also microgrids that can get used in other parts of Asia Pacific to bring electricity to people who don't have it, and then to bring renewable electricity right from the start.
I'll add to that. One of the key recommendations we made in our electricity review was that variable renewable energy, typically solar and wind, needed to be able to deliver on demand. Not in the same way as an existing coal or gas station, which could in principle, or hydro could go for days, but typically into the hot evening hours. People come home from work on a hot February day, and by about 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, even though the sun is still high, it's not facing the panels on the rooftops anymore, so the sunlight drops away. Typically on those hot days there's not much wind, and that's when we have the blackouts, the rolling blackouts in South Australia or in New South Wales. So storage, as Lara was saying, is critically important. There are a number of ways to do it. You can do pumped hydro, you've heard about that, and pumped hydro has enormous storage capacity, but it's a big step. You can't do a little or a small pumped hydro, you've got to do a multi-$100 million pumped hydro somewhere in the country and bring that power in. The beauty of batteries is they're so scalable. You can have small ones at home, you can have giant ones like in South Australia, connected to the electricity grid to supply the large requirements of parts of a state. And that versatility is really a part of their strength. But also they can be used for more things than just storage. Storage is what you tend to think about them being used for, but they can also act to correct frequency fluctuations in the electricity system. And by doing that, they help with the continuity or the security of supply in the electricity grid. They can help prevent complete statewide blackouts like we had back in September. But I'm a fan of Tesla. I drive a Tesla motor car, so I'm in the mobile Tesla area, and it's just phenomenal to see that the utility is benefiting from the technological enhancements that have been occurring now for about 10 to 15 years to satisfy the mobility market. Lithium-ion batteries weren't developed for cars, they weren't developed for utility storage, they were developed for smartphones and laptops. And that technology was then taken to vehicles, and now it's being taken to utility scale storage or home storage. So it's a wonderful story of a technology that is continuing to be refined and finding multiple applications.
Whilst people are thinking, if we stick on batteries, what about the cheap part of the trilemma? Because batteries, don't they cost a lot right now? And what is the trajectory for the costs coming down?
I'm not going to give numbers, unfortunately, but certainly I think, Kelly, in terms of looking to achieve that mass uptake and accelerating that, then cost is a critical factor. And I think the way that we're looking and others are looking to achieve that is scale. So the Gigafactory in Nevada will produce 50 gigawatt hours of batteries, which at the time it was first commenced manufacturing in 2014. The total amount of lithium ion being manufactured in the world that include batteries in smartphones, other electric vehicles, laptops. So that one factory will produce that amount, and we've already announced that we're going to be opening other factories. So the scale is coming. I really feel like we're at that point where these things sometimes start slowly and people say they're slower than expected, but that scale is coming very quickly.
Yeah. I'll add that pricing going forward, it's really complex. There are a lot of people who I meet who tend to think that the high prices we have today are because of renewables. And it's just not wrong. Can I do a pop quiz? Is that legitimate?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, pop quiz. In the first 5 months of this year, which mainland state had the smallest amount of renewables? Guess. Queensland. It was actually Queensland. They've got 7 or 8%. Which mainland state had the greatest intensity of renewables? South Australia, approaching 50%. Which mainland state had the highest electricity prices? Queensland. So the logic that some people will say that coal equates to cheap electricity, renewables equates to expensive electricity, is clearly broken. At least that logic doesn't apply in Queensland. There are many reasons. One is for the high prices of electricity. One is the high price of gas. That is the price setter for many, many hours of the year. And there are a number of policy and other issues that have caused gas prices to go up, and there is pressure to bring them down again. Another big reason, and it's sad, is market concentration. When there are too few players in the electricity generation market, they might not play according to the rules. And so that happens too. But probably the least of the going forward problems will be the cost contribution of renewables, because as Lara was saying, they're coming down, and they're coming down fast. You said fast, let me put a number on it. The price of lithium-ion batteries at scale is halving actually more frequently, but let's say every 5 years, halving, which means that in 10 years from now to replace, if you have to replace the battery in South Australia, it'll cost a quarter of the price, so half of a half. And there's no sign of that slowing down. It's just ingenuity that is driving a revolution in cost, in energy density and in quality. And we benefit from that. And we're seeing the same thing in solar, and we're seeing the same thing in wind, and we're seeing the same thing in smart digital technologies that make it easier for us to integrate all of these renewables. So I'm making it sound easy. It's not. It's very, very hard. And I'm not a supporter of the idea of rushing to replace our electricity system with renewables. The electricity system in Australia is one giant connected electricity machine, and you can't turn it around on a dime. It will take decades to get there, but we can get there, and I do think we can get there at never the low cost of the past, but lowish cost and high reliability and absolutely low emissions, approaching zero emissions generation.
Excellent. Tony?
Dr. Finkel, there's 49 recommendations. Sorry, Dr. Finkel, there's 49 recommendations have been accepted. I'd love to hear in your words why that 50th one, the CET, is so important.
Oh, I thought you were going to ask me why it's not accepted. They're all important to different degrees. And this is the most extreme case of a glass half empty, not your question, but the dialogue out there is the most extreme case of a glass half empty perception that I've ever seen. So 49 out of 50 is 98%. And if I'm going to be pedantic, I'll point out that the one that hasn't been accepted is actually 3 parts, and one of the 3 parts has been accepted. So we're at 49 and a third out of 50. And the focus is on the 2/3 that hasn't got across the line yet. The other 49 are important and will bring order to the regulation of the industry, to the fact that in the past we've been allowing wind and solar just to be tacked onto the system without thinking about how they should be effectively integrated. There are requirements for dispatchability, in other words, wind and solar being available when needed. So they're all critically important. And one of the ones that's been accepted is almost as important as the emissions reduction trajectory that has not been accepted, and that's to create a new board called the Energy Security Board. And when that was first made public, a lot of people groaned and they said, Alan, where are you coming from? There are already too many regulators in the electricity system, but that's why we recommended another one, because there needs to be some cohesion between, at the very top, the COAG Energy Council, and then reporting to them at the moment, or ongoing, but reporting to them is the energy market operator and the commission and the regulator, and it needs to be brought together. And the new board has the responsibility of driving the change. So the important thing is that that new board has been accepted, and they have already been charged by the COAG Energy Council to start delivering on the 48 that remain. So there's one that's not accepted, one is them, that leaves 48. Did that address your question?
Not really.
I didn't think so.
No, I really thought that last 2/3 was all about how to make the transition.
Okay. So the last 2/3 is actually 2 parts. There's 3 parts, but one's been accepted. The one that's been accepted is a 3-year notice of closure. But what in this one recommendation, we called it the orderly transition, if you look at the report. And the orderly transition consists of all of the states and the Commonwealth government and territories buying into, accepting an agreed trajectory for lowering emissions into the future. And that is a big statement because we're refocusing the discussion. First of all, we're talking about agreeing to lowering emissions into the future. We're not talking about a certain degree of renewable energy. You think about the targets and the discussion out there. Everybody's talking about getting 40% renewable energy or 50% renewable energy. I say, who cares? Who cares? Does the atmosphere, does climate know about renewable energy? No. What actually is the outcome of relevance is atmospheric emissions of carbon dioxide, because that has an impact on global warming. And so we said that the focus has to be on emissions rather than the generation mix. That's the first change. And the second is that we recommended a continuous reduction rather than a fixed target. So at the moment, the discussion is mostly about a 2030 target. The trouble with the 2030 target is you get to there and you say, what next? And you might have got into trouble. So a few months ago, there was a lot of discussion about replacing all of the Australian coal fleet, the electricity generation from coal fleet, with so-called high efficiency, low emissions Healy generation. And if the only thing that you ever cared about for eternity was the 2030 Paris target, you'd meet it. You'd meet it. Because those Healy generators are about 15 to 20% more efficient than the current crop of coal generators, and that's what you need to get to the 28% reduction by 2030. But then you would have lock-in for the next 50 years, because that's about the amount of time that a coal generation plant operates. So if you think about a fixed target, you could get into deep trouble. So we've recommended, as our first recommendation in the orderly transition, that the governments agree to a continuous trajectory towards zero in the middle of the second half of the century. The second component in that orderly transition recommendation is what's called the clean energy target, which is actually the mechanism that will enable the electricity market operator to guarantee that we either meet or better that trajectory for emissions reduction. And the third, to round out the package, was a requirement that large existing generators have to give a 3-year notice of closure. One reason is to complete the economic package, if you like, or the policy package, by ensuring that you don't get a sudden loss without time for the renewable energy or gas generation companies to fill the gap. And when Hazelwood closed with a 5 months notice of closure, yeah, that's a market pull indicator, but there's not enough time for the investors to respond. But the other very important reason is to give communities enough time to adjust, because you've had communities that have had 30, 40 or longer, 60 or 70 years in that industry. And when you get what has been the typical numbers to date for coal closures of 1, 3 or 5 months closure, it's actually quite tragic, the impact on those communities. So that last one has been accepted by the Commonwealth Government in the States. It's the first two, the trajectory and the mechanism to make it work. It's very, very important, not only for meeting the Paris commitment and the long-term aspirations, but it's also important to bring policy certainty back into the investment environment. And that's what's missing more than anything else.
Can I ask both of you, given the increasing, in terms of the vision that you both have for the grid and the complexity of it in terms of individuals connecting to it, different sources of energy, and therefore the power of the internet being a sort of connectivity and driver for all of this, I wonder what you see as the increasing risks. I mean, we're speaking about the positive growth and the positive flexibility and the positive impact on the environment and the cost and the cleaner, etc. But what about the risks? So what about, I think, Alan, you briefly mentioned cyber. What about the ability of individuals to corrupt the grid? What about cyber? What about other risks that you see, and how should we be dealing with them at the same time as we evolve to cleaner, greener and more secure?
I'm happy to take that on initially. So perhaps not surprisingly, certainly for us at Tesla and I think a number of other participants, we're very conscious of those risks and how we protect against them. We start sort of from the premise of our batteries are often underneath a whole family and moving around because they start, in the car, and therefore we want to make sure that they're as safe and secure as possible. And I could go into the different ways that we do to protect that, and a lot of our product is done and improved through over-the-air updates. So it's this sort of concept that the product or the car that you buy, the worst day should be the day you buy it and then it actually just gets better and better over time as we push updates through what it can do. And for that reason, and I'll come back directly to your question in a moment, Gillian, it doesn't have many buttons on the dash, because why would you lock in functionality with buttons when you can improve that functionality over time? And one of those functionalities is definitely around security and how we can ensure security. I think the other thing that's important when I often hear about those debates is the risk of doing nothing. And I think sometimes that's not fully quantified of what happens if we don't make some of these shifts. And certainly, and for those that have had the chance to drive in a Tesla car and what it can do, and then its decision-making ability, much as I dislike it, is better than my decision-making ability as a human. And we have to think about, I'm sure and we've seen where there are accidents and there can be a focus on what happened. We also really need to think about actually we can improve by using the technology that we have at hand, and a lot of that comes through software.
Gillian, it's a huge and real issue, but it's in no way unique to the electricity generation system. Or is it only relevant to the new system? So 2 or 3 years ago in the Ukraine, and they do not have the world's most advanced electricity system. Their electricity system got completely shut down by a cyber attack, which was a real surprise because their system was not so automated that you'd think it'd be easy, but the cyber criminals got in and actually pretended to the computers that they were an operator sitting at the console, and they moved the mouse remotely and did terrible things. As we go forward, there are more ways that complex systems can be attacked. It's just an obligation on the industry, regulated appropriately, to put in all the current best defences against that. But if you think it's a problem in the electricity industry, think about flying in a modern aeroplane. I mean, they are highly, highly sophisticated computing machines. Think about the banking system. Think about hospitals, which are becoming more and more computerised, and even in the intensive care, individual beds. Cybersecurity is something that is a problem for every aspect of our life. It's not a unique problem in the electricity industry, and there are ways of dealing with it.
Thank you.